October 1942. The air over the wasteland south of El Alamein is a shimmering, suffocating blanket of heat. It is an atmosphere thick with fine dust, the pulverized remains of a world bleached bone white by the Sunday. For a panzer grenadier of the Deutsches Afrika Korps, crouched in the shallow scrape that passes for a trench, the world has shrunk to this gritty reality. Thirst is not an inconvenience. It is a physical presence, a constant rasp at the back of the throat, a dull ache behind the eyes. Water is rationed in foul-tasting, lukewarm mouthfuls from a canteen that feels impossibly heavy, and yet is always nearly empty. The enemy is the British Eighth Army, their 25-pounder guns, a persistent, menacing drumbeat on the horizon. But the true enemy, the one that gnaws at morale and grinds down machines, is the logistics line, a fragile, 1,000-mile thread stretching back to Tripoli, a thread perpetually frayed by the Royal Navy and the Desert Air Force. Here, in the crucible of the North African campaign, a specific type of soldier was forged, a veteran defined not just by combat, but by a profound and deeply ingrained understanding of scarcity. This is not simply a story about the clash of armies. It is the story of the collision between two irreconcilable realities, a war fought by men who counted every bullet and every drop of water, and a war waged by a nation so prodigiously wealthy, it could offer its vanquished enemies a luxury as casual and commonplace as a bottle of Coca-Cola. This is the story of why that simple act of hospitality was more psychologically devastating than a tank shell, revealing a truth about modern warfare that no German training could have ever prepared them for, that the Second World War would not be won by the finest soldier, but by the most productive factory. The strategic dilemma was perfectly understood at the highest levels of command. Erwin Rommel, the celebrated Desert Fox, was a master of audacious maneuver, but his genius was constantly shackled by the brutal arithmetic of supply. His memoir is a litany of frustrations, a constant plea for more fuel, more tanks, more ammunition. But for a more granular, officer-level perspective, the writings of Major Hans von Luck, commanding a reconnaissance battalion in the 21st Panzer Division, are indispensable. He paints a picture of a force operating on a knife's edge, where victory and defeat were measured in jerrycans of gasoline. Von Luck wrote of the constant, draining uncertainty. Day after day we were promised replenishment of our fuel, ammunition and food stocks. The supplies seldom arrived, for the British Air Force and submarines were sinking one transport ship after another in the Mediterranean. This wasn't a temporary shortage, it was the fundamental strategic reality of the theatre. His panzers, marvels of German engineering, were often rendered immobile, becoming little more than static pillboxes in the sand, not for lack of courage or skill in their crews, but for lack of petroleum. Von Luck describes the bitter irony of seeing the British, even in retreat, leaving behind veritable dumps of supplies, canned goods, ammunition, fuel barrels that his own men would fall upon with desperate relief. This was the view from the command half-track, a clear-eyed assessment of a war of attrition they were mathematically destined to lose unless the supply lines were secured. For the common Lanzer, the strategic calculus was felt in a more visceral way. The daily reality for a soldier in the 15th Panzer Division, for example, was one of constant improvisation and making do with less. The official ration was already meagre by European standards, but what was on paper rarely matched what ended up in their mess kits. Men lived on hard biscuits, thin soups, and a gritty ersatz coffee that did little to combat the lethargy of the heat. The personal accounts collected after the war speak volumes. One veteran recalled how the highlight of a week might be the sharing of a single can of peaches pilfered from a British supply truck. Water discipline was absolute. It was used for drinking, and only for drinking. Shaving was a dry, painful affair, and hygiene was a forgotten luxury. This chronic deprivation had a corrosive effect on both man and machine. The same fine sand that got into a soldier's food and clothes worked its way into the engines of the Panzer IIIs and IVs. Without adequate supplies of lubricants, filters and spare parts, the mechanical attrition was staggering. A tank that broke down in the field was often a tank lost for good. cannibalized for parts to keep another one running for a few more days. This experience bred a specific mindset. The world was a place of finite, precious resources. Everything had to be conserved, reused, or repurposed. Waste was not just inefficient, it was a sin against survival itself, a luxury that only the enemy could afford. The numbers behind this reality are staggering and paint a clear picture of the industrial and logistical imbalance. In the critical months leading up to the Second Battle of El Alamein, the Axis supply situation in the Mediterranean went from critical to catastrophic. Historian Martin van Creveld's seminal work, Supplying War, lays out the grim statistics. In August of 1942, out of 73,000 tons of supplies dispatched for Rommel's army from Italy, a full 29% was sunk en route. In September, the losses rose to 31%. By October, as Montgomery prepared his offensive, a staggering 44% of all Axis supply ships heading for North Africa were sent to the bottom of the Mediterranean, taking with them the fuel, tanks, and artillery shells that were the lifeblood of the Panzer Army Afrika. To sustain a single panzer division in moderate combat required a minimum of 350 tons of supplies per day. With 2 German and several Italian armoured divisions under his command, Rommel's needs were immense. Yet on many days, the total tonnage reaching him was less than what was required for a single division. On the eve of Montgomery's Operation Lightfoot, the Afrika Korps had enough fuel for only 3 days of intensive combat. This wasn't a failure of German fighting spirit. It was a colossal, unmitigated failure of logistics, a direct consequence of an industrial system being outpaced and a naval presence being overwhelmed. This, then, was the man who would eventually find himself a prisoner of war in America. He was not a caricature from a propaganda film. He was a hardened, professional soldier, tempered in the brutal kiln of the desert. His entire existence for months, or even years, had been governed by the physics of scarcity. He understood the value of a litre of fuel in terms of kilometres of advance or retreat. He knew the precise worth of a handful of bullets. He had been trained to see the world as a place of brutal competition for limited resources. It was this man, with this psychology, who was about to be plucked from the parched, resource-starved battlefields of North Africa and dropped into the heart of a nation whose sheer, casual, and seemingly infinite abundance would challenge the very foundations of his worldview. The journey across the Atlantic was more than a geographical relocation. It was a passage into another reality, a world where the fundamental laws of existence as he knew them were about to be utterly and irrevocably broken. To understand the depth of the shock that awaited them in America, one must first understand the men themselves. The soldiers of the Deutsches Afrika Korps were not merely German soldiers who happened to be fighting in Africa. They were, in their own minds and in the perception of the German public, a distinct and elite fraternity. They were the Times Afrika Kämpfer *, the Africa Fighters, a brotherhood forged in the uniquely unforgiving environment of the Western Desert. Their war was different. It was not the grinding, mud-soaked, and ideologically poisoned war of the Eastern Front, a war of annihilation against a people deemed subhuman. The Desert War, as they saw it, was a war of movement, of skill, of professional soldiers pitted against other professional soldiers. It was a clean war, or so the myth went, a modern-day knightly contest set against a vast, empty canvas. This self-perception was their armour, a psychological defence built on shared hardship, immense pride in their commander, and a carefully constructed propaganda narrative that elevated them to the status of martial heroes. This very identity, so powerfully forged in the heat and dust of North Africa, would soon be tested not by artillery, but by something far more insidious, overwhelming, undeniable, and utterly casual abundance. The foundation of this unique times, esprit de corps times, was their almost fanatical devotion to their commander, Erwin Rommel. To the men serving under him, he was not some distant general, but a leader who was always at the front, his command vehicle often the first to crest a ridge, his face caked in the same dust that covered theirs. The letters sent home from North Africa, collected and analysed by historians, are filled with this reverence. A young grenadier named Klaus wrote to his parents in 1941, "We would follow Rommel to the ends of the earth. He shares our thirst and our short rations, and he knows how to win." This was a recurring theme. The shared suffering, the common experience of scarcity described in the previous chapter, was not just a hardship, it was a bonding agent. It created an inverted snobbery, a sense of superiority over the troops living in relative comfort in occupied France or Norway. They were the ones enduring the flies, the dysentery, the sandstorms, the constant lack of water. They took a grim pride in their ability to endure, to improvise, to make war with a fraction of the resources afforded to their opponents. A popular soldier's song of the era, the Panzerrollen in Afrika Korps, captured this spirit, celebrating their own toughness and their advance across the sands. This identity was reinforced by tangible symbols: the pith helmet, the sun-bleached uniforms, the coveted Afrika Cup title. To be a veteran of the DK was to be part of a special class, a man who had been tested in the purest form of warfare and had not been found wanting. This sense of professionalism was particularly acute among the officer corps. Lieutenant Heinz Werner Schmidt, Rommel's aide-de-camp, provides a vivid account in his memoir, With Rommel in the Desert. His writing reflects a deep respect for the tactical challenges of desert warfare and an equally deep respect for his British adversaries. He describes the conflict as a war without hate, a phrase that appears frequently in the memoirs of DAC veterans. Schmidt recounts instances of civility, of sharing water with captured British soldiers, of burying the enemy dead with military honours. This was not necessarily born of a moral rejection of Nazism, but rather from a shared experience of fighting a common enemy, the desert itself. In this vast emptiness, the traditional lines between friend and foe could sometimes blur in the face of a more immediate struggle for survival. Tactically, the Afrika Korps was forced to be innovative. The legendary use of the 88mm anti-aircraft gun as a tank killer was a prime example of this battlefield adaptation. Lacking sufficient dedicated anti-tank guns, they turned a defensive weapon into the most feared artillery piece in the desert. This culture of making do, of turning weakness into a strength through cleverness and skill, further solidified their self-image as an elite fighting force, masters of their craft. However, this identity was not entirely self-generated. It was expertly cultivated and amplified by Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry back in Berlin. The German press and newsreels presented a highly romanticized image of the Afrika Korps. They were portrayed as chivalrous, sun-bronzed warriors, embodying the National Socialist ideal of martial prowess. Newsreels showed smiling, confident soldiers, masterfully handling their advanced weaponry, with Rommel, the dashing and brilliant desert fox, leading them to glorious victory. The grim realities of the war, the rampant disease, the crippling supply shortages, the horrific burns suffered by tank crews in brewed-up panzers were carefully excised from the narrative. This propaganda served a dual purpose. For the German home front, it provided a much-needed stream of good news and created a set of national heroes that were less controversial than the SS figures associated with the brutal occupation policies in the East. But just as importantly, this myth-making was consumed by the soldiers themselves. They read the papers, they heard the radio broadcasts, and they internalized this heroic image. It reinforced their belief that they were special, that their sacrifices were part of a noble and chivalrous undertaking. This carefully constructed narrative became an integral part of their psychological makeup, a lens through which they viewed themselves and their war. The DAC veteran, therefore, on the eve of his capture in Tunisia in late 1942 or early 1943, was a complex figure. He was a professional soldier, often highly skilled and combat-proven. He was fiercely proud of his unit and his commander. He was conditioned by years of extreme scarcity, viewing the world as a zero-sum game of limited resources, and critically, his entire worldview was underpinned by a powerful myth, a belief in the clean war and in his own identity as a member of an elite, almost knightly, order. He saw his British and Commonwealth opponents as worthy, professional adversaries, and believed the war in the desert was a contest of skill and will, a contest his side was losing only because of a lack of fuel and bullets. It was this man, with this precise set of beliefs and psychological conditionings, who was about to board a ship and sail into the heart of the enemy's industrial machine. He was prepared for a fight, for interrogation, for a harsh but predictable prison camp experience. He was in no way prepared for what he was about to find. He was not ready for a nation where the very concept of scarcity seemed not to exist, a place where the logic of his entire world would be turned upside down by a simple, sugary, carbonated drink. The end came suddenly, and with a surreal quiet. In May 1943, near Cap Bon, Tunisia, the remnants of the once mighty Panzer Army Afrika, surrounded and out of fuel, ammunition, and hope, began to surrender en masse. For the men of the Afrika Korps, this moment was a profound psychological schism. One day they were elite soldiers, the Afrika Kämpfer, fighting for every meter of ground. The next, they were a shuffling, exhausted column of prisoners, their weapons stacked in silent pyramids under the watchful eyes of American GIs who seemed impossibly young and well-fed. The fight was over, but a disorienting uncertainty began. Their commander, Rommel, had been evacuated. Their mythos had been broken against a wall of steel and high explosives. The world as they knew it, a world of dust, thirst, and desperate combat, had ceased to exist. In its place was a void, a future dictated entirely by the will of their enemy. As they were herded into temporary holding pens, the first question, whispered among the ranks, was simple and primal. What happens now? The answer was something none of them could have possibly conceived. The initial stages of captivity were a source of deep cognitive dissonance. Conditioned by Goebbels' propaganda to expect brutality at the hands of the Americans portrayed as a decadent, mongrelized nation of gangsters and cowboys, the prisoners were instead met with a surprising and unnerving professionalism. Historian Arnold Kramer's extensive collection of POW interviews reveals a consistent pattern in these first encounters. A German NCO, captured near Bizerte, recalled his shock. "We expected to be beaten, at the very least. Instead, they gave us a cigarette and a can of something they called spam. It was greasy and strange, but it was food. More food than we had seen in weeks. This was not an isolated incident. The American quartermasters, it seemed, had a logistical plan for everything, including the processing of 250,000 enemy soldiers. There were forms to be filled out, tags to be issued, medical checks to be performed. The process was efficient, impersonal, and devoid of the vengeful malice they had been led to anticipate. This initial treatment did not inspire gratitude, it inspired confusion. It was their first clue that the enemy they had been fighting was not the one they had been told about. The reality was something far more organized, more powerful, and in its own way, more intimidating. The true scale of their captors' power was revealed during the journey across the Atlantic. Packed by the thousand into the holds of Liberty ships, the mass-produced cargo vessels that were the workhorses of the Allied war effort, the prisoners endured a miserable voyage. The conditions were cramped, the air was foul, and seasickness was rampant. Yet, for those who were allowed on deck for brief periods, a spectacle unfolded that dwarfed their personal discomfort. It was the convoy. Stretched across the ocean from horizon to horizon was an endless armada of ships, tankers, transports, cargo vessels, and surrounding them all, the sleek, grey shapes of destroyers and corvettes. Hans-Dieter Suthoff, a young soldier and artist who documented his captivity, later described the sight. "It was then that I think we first understood. To supply Rommel, a few ships would try to sneak across the Mediterranean. Most were sunk. Here, the Americans moved an entire city across the ocean as if it were nothing. We saw freighters and tankers in numbers we did not believe existed. It was not a battle group. It was an industrial conveyor belt. For a soldier from the Afrika Korps, whose entire war had been defined by the lack of supply, this was a stunning, irrefutable visual lesson in logistics. It was a fleet that represented a productive capacity so vast it beggared belief. This visual evidence was backed by cold, hard numbers that defined an unbridgeable logistical chasm between the Axis powers and the United States. Transporting the roughly 425,000 German and Italian prisoners captured in all theaters to America was one of the largest human relocation efforts in military history. The U.S. War Shipping Administration dedicated hundreds of vessels to the task. These were not frontline warships, but the very Liberty ships and tankers that were coming off American slipways at a rate of more than 3 per day. The fuel consumed by a single one of these transatlantic convoys would have been enough to keep Rommel's entire Panzer Army operational for months. The manpower required simply to crew the ships, guard the prisoners, and manage the logistics at the ports of embarkation and arrival numbered in the tens of thousands. Germany's war effort was crippled by its inability to secure its supply lines across the relatively narrow Mediterranean Sea. The United States, by contrast, projected its power across the 3,000 miles of the hostile North Atlantic with an efficiency and on a scale that was simply beyond the comprehension of the German High Command. The DAK veteran on the deck of that ship was not just a prisoner of war, he was a first-hand witness to the strategic equation that had already sealed his nation's fate. As the long voyage neared its end, a new sight appeared on the horizon. For some, it was the coastline of Virginia. For others, the unmistakable skyline of New York City. The reaction was a mixture of awe, dread, and profound bewilderment. They saw towering buildings that dwarfed anything in Berlin or Munich. They saw harbours choked with shipping, bridges of impossible length and grace. Those who sailed into New York Harbour passed the Statue of Liberty, a symbol whose meaning was utterly lost on them. They did not see it as a beacon of hope or freedom. They saw it as a monument to a colossal and alien power. The nation, they had been told, was weak and degenerate. The propaganda had been a lie. The nation they were entering was not a hollow giant. It was a titan, whose industrial sinews they had just witnessed, spanning an entire ocean. The desert had taught them the laws of scarcity. America was about to teach them a new and terrible lesson in the power of infinite production. The greatest shock was yet to come, and it would not be found in a factory or on a production line, but in the simple, mundane, and utterly unbelievable contents of a small, curved glass bottle. The moment the gangplank lowered onto the docks of Norfolk, Virginia, the men of the Afrika Korps were subjected to a sensory assault unlike any they had ever known. The first shock was the noise. It was not the percussive, violent sound of the battlefield, the crump of mortars, the shriek of Stukas, the chatter of machine guns. This was a different kind of sound, a symphony of overwhelming power. It was the deep thrum of industry, the roar of cranes, the clanging of shunted railway cars, the hiss of steam, and the constant underlying hum of a nation operating at full capacity. The second shock was the sight. Their eyes, accustomed to the featureless desert or the bombed-out ruins of European ports like Naples, were met with an unbroken panorama of wholeness. There were no skeletal remains of bombed buildings, no rubble-strewn streets, no shell craters. Every structure was intact, its windows gleaming in the Sunday, and then there were the vehicles. Not drab, camouflaged military trucks, but a seemingly infinite river of civilian automobiles, gleaming in a rainbow of colours, moving with a casual, unhurried purpose. This wasn't a military base. It was a functioning, thriving city, utterly untouched and seemingly unimpressed by the distant war that had consumed their entire world. The journey inland was a rolling tableau of disbelief, a cross-country lesson in economic supremacy. Herded onto trains, not cattle cars, but passenger carriages with cushioned seats, the prisoners began a journey that systematically dismantled their every assumption about the enemy. Georg Gärtner, a soldier who would later become famous for escaping and remaining in America for 40 years, meticulously documented his impressions in a secret diary. He wrote of his astonishment as the train rolled for hours, then for days, through a landscape of impossible prosperity. He described endless fields of corn and wheat, so vast they seemed to run to the edge of the world, all being worked by giant machines I could not recognize. Every small town they passed was a fresh shock, Gärtner noted, with a sense of wonder, the houses, each one a detached wooden structure with a manicured lawn and, almost always, an automobile parked in the driveway. Through the train windows, he saw shop fronts overflowing with goods, piles of fruit, displays of clothing, windows filled with radios and household appliances. For a man whose family in Germany was subsisting on strict rationing, where a single egg was a luxury, the sight of such casual, unthinking abundance was profoundly unsettling. It spoke of a productive capacity that was not just geared for war, but was so immense it could sustain a level of consumer comfort that was unimaginable even in pre-war Germany. Other accounts echo Gärtner's experience, focusing on the human landscape. Reinhard Frank, another POW, later spoke of his fascination with the civilians they saw at railway crossings. They were not gaunt or weary, their faces etched with the anxieties of war. They were well-dressed, plump, and radiated an aura of confidence and ease. The men wore colourful suits, the women wore bright dresses and lipstick. There was a shocking absence of uniforms, a near-total lack of military presence that seemed bizarre for a nation supposedly engaged in a life-or-death struggle. Frank recalled the children who would sometimes wave at the train, their faces healthy and carefree. It was a stark, painful contrast to the Hitler youth boys he had seen back home, their childhoods sacrificed to paramilitary drills and the gathering of scrap metal for the war effort. The American home front did not look like a home front at all. It looked like a nation at peace, a nation whose involvement in the global conflict was a distant, industrial enterprise rather than a matter of daily, grinding, existential survival. This realization was a slow-acting poison, planting a seed of doubt. How could Germany possibly prevail against an enemy that did not even seem to notice it was at war? The visual evidence was supported by an industrial reality that was, in its own way, more terrifying than any weapon. While Albert Speer was performing miracles of rationalization to squeeze every last tank and artillery piece out of Germany's strained war economy, an effort that necessitated the complete cessation of all non-essential, Production America was demonstrating that it could do both. By 1943, the production of civilian automobiles in Germany had been zero for years. Every scrap of steel, every litre of rubber, every man-hour of labor was directed to the Wehrmacht. In the United States, while Detroit was indeed the heart of the arsenal of democracy, churning out Sherman tanks and B-24 bombers at a prodigious rate, the nation's consumer economy had not shut down. In 1941, before the complete shift to war production, American factories had produced over 3.7 million passenger cars. Even with wartime restrictions, the existing civilian vehicle fleet was immense. In 1943, there were over 25 million registered private automobiles in the United States. For the German POWs, seeing this vast personal mobility was a powerful symbol. It wasn't just about the cars themselves. It was about the entire industrial ecosystem they represented, the oil refineries, the rubber plantations, the steel mills, the paved roads, a system so vast and robust that it could simultaneously field the largest military force in history and keep its civilian population on wheels. This journey from the port to the POW camp was, in effect, a form of psychological warfare, more potent than any leaflet drop or radio broadcast. It was a bombardment of undeniable facts. There was no need for propaganda to embellish the truth. The truth was overwhelming enough on its own. Every mile of track, every thriving town, every well-fed citizen was a testament to the enemy's power. It was a power that was not just military, but economic, industrial, and societal. The men of the Afrika Korps had been conditioned to believe they were the products of a superior system, a martial ideal that would triumph through will and sacrifice. But what they saw from the windows of their prison train was a system that did not seem to require sacrifice, a system that generated power and wealth on a scale that rendered their own nation's desperate, totalizing war effort almost pitiful by comparison. The shock was not of seeing the enemy's strength, but the enemy's normality. This was the true terror of the American heartland, its profound, unassailable, and utterly placid prosperity. They had yet to be given their first Coca-Cola, but the bottle was already being filled. After the disorienting journey through the American heartland, the final destination was another shock. For the men destined for a place like Camp Hearn in the vast emptiness of Texas, the term prison camp conjured images of bleak, barbed wire enclosures with crude huts and watchtowers, a slightly more organized version of the temporary pens they had left in Tunisia. What they found instead was a small, meticulously planned town. The barracks were not rough-hewn shacks, but sturdy, weatherproof wooden structures laid out in neat rows along graded streets. There were dedicated mess halls, administration buildings, a post exchange, workshops, and even designated fields for recreation. To the German prisoners, who were accustomed to the Wehrmacht's own austere and functional approach to cantonment, this looked less like a facility for housing defeated enemies and more like a permanent garrison for their own troops. The sheer investment in infrastructure was baffling. The American captors had expended a significant amount of lumber, manpower, and planning to construct these camps, a level of effort that seemed utterly disproportionate to the task of simply warehousing prisoners. It was yet another piece of a puzzle that was becoming increasingly disturbing. The enemy operated on a scale of resource expenditure that simply defied their own logic of war. The first official meal in the camp mess hall was a moment of profound, almost spiritual, dislocation. The Afrika Korps veterans shuffled into the clean, spacious hall and were met with an aroma they had long forgotten, the smell of baking bread and roasting meat. In front of them were long tables laden with food, served not in meagre scoops, but in heaps. There were platters of sliced beef, bowls of potatoes, vegetables, and most astonishingly, stacks of pure white bread. Not the coarse, grey, sawdust-filled Times, Kriegsbrot Times, war bread, that was the staple of the German military and civilian population, but soft, fluffy, immaculate white bread, accompanied by dishes of real butter. Coffee, a luxury replaced by chicory root ersatz for years, was served hot, strong, and with bowls of granulated sugar placed casually on the tables. Testimonies from this moment are filled with a sense of dreamlike disbelief. One prisoner, quoted in Arnold Kramer's definitive study, recalled seeing men weep openly at the sight. It was not just the quantity of the food, but the quality and the casualness of its presentation. This was not a feast for a special occasion. This was a standard daily ration. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. It was a direct, irrefutable contradiction of everything they had been told and everything they had experienced. Their own nation was starving its people and sacrificing everything for the war effort. America, it seemed, could feed its prisoners better than Germany could feed its own soldiers. Then came the carbonated shockwave. As the men were finishing this unbelievable meal, American quartermasters moved down the tables, distributing a small, dark, curved glass bottle to each prisoner. It was a Coca-Cola. For the vast majority of the German soldiers, it was an object of complete mystery. They turned it over in their hands, examining the unfamiliar red and white script. Some thought it was a type of beer, or perhaps a strong liquor. Others, more suspicious, wondered if it was some kind of medicine or chemical they were being forced to ingest. A German NCO, taking charge, mimicked the American Guard's action of popping the cap and cautiously took a sip. A moment of silence fell over the hall as the men watched him. His eyes widened slightly. He took another, longer drink. Hesitantly, the other prisoners followed suit. The sensation was utterly alien. The fizz, the intense sweetness, the unique, cloying, and yet strangely refreshing flavour was like nothing they had ever tasted. But it was the realization that followed the taste that struck with the force of a physical blow. A single soldier, holding the cold bottle in his hand, would have traced the condensation with his finger, the gears of his mind grinding to process the implications. This was not a rare spoil of war, captured from a British officer's stores. This was being given to them, the lowest of the low, as a common, everyday item. The logistics behind that single bottle were an industrial epic, a microcosm of the very power that had defeated them. What the German prisoner could not know was that the Coca-Cola company was a vital component of the American war machine, designated by the War Department as an essential industry for the maintenance of troop morale. General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself had specifically requested that bottling plants be established as close to the front lines as possible. Consequently, the company dispatched a cadre of technical observers, clad in military-style uniforms, whose sole job was to supervise the construction and operation of 64 new bottling plants in North Africa, Europe, and the Pacific. Between 1941 and 1945, the Coca-Cola Company produced over 10 billion servings of its drink for the American military and its allies. The sugar, the glass for the bottles, the steel for the caps, the rubber for the delivery truck tires, and the fuel to transport it all across the globe were allocated by the same authorities who allocated steel for Sherman tanks and aluminum for B-17 bombers. The bottle in that prisoner's hand was not a mere refreshment. It was a standardized, mass-produced, and globally distributed industrial product, an emblem of a consumer capitalist system so powerful and so confident that it considered a soft drink to be a non-negotiable component of its war-making capacity. The silence in the mess hall after that first taste was the sound of a worldview cracking. In that one bottle was the answer to the riddle of the endless convoys, the undamaged cities, the rivers of automobiles, and the mountains of white bread. It was the taste of a different kind of power. German power was brittle, focused, and extractive. It was the power of a nation that had mortgaged its entire civilian economy to build a magnificent, but ultimately finite, war machine. American power was something else entirely. It was deep, elastic, and generative. It was the power of a nation that could produce guns times and times butter, tanks times and times Coca-Cola, in quantities that defied imagination. The bottle of Coke was a liquid weapon, a tangible and undeniable symbol of the colossal economic chasm that separated the two nations. For the proud veterans of the Afrika Korps, who had been taught that their martial spirit and Spartan endurance made them superior, this was a devastating revelation. They had been defeated not by a better soldier, but by a better factory, and the proof was right there in their hands, cold, sweet, and utterly humiliating. The initial shock, that stunning moment of sweet, fizzy disbelief in the mess hall, soon subsided. It was replaced by something quieter, more corrosive, and far more dangerous to the prisoner's morale: intellectual deconstruction. The empty Coca-Cola bottle ceased to be a mere piece of trash. It became an artifact, an object of intense study and debate. In the long, idle hours of captivity, the men of the Afrika Korps, engineers, mechanics, farmers, and students in their former lives began to apply their disciplined German minds to the riddle of this simple object. They would hold it up to the light, note the quality of the glass, the precision of the embossed lettering, the perfection of the standardized steel cap. The bottle was a tangible piece of evidence from a world that should not exist according to their worldview, and they were determined to understand how it was possible. This was no longer an emotional reaction to a luxury. It was a forensic investigation into the source of their own defeat. Within the intellectual ecosystem of the POW camps, this topic became a source of endless argument. The camps often published their own newspapers, such as Der Ruf, The Call, which, while managed by American authorities, became forums for prisoners to grapple with their new reality. The debates were fierce. The hardline National Socialists, clinging to their ideology, would argue that the Coca-Cola was a symbol of American decadence and weakness. It was, they claimed, a sugary poison designed to soften a population, a testament to a materialistic culture that lacked the Spartan warrior spirit of the Third Reich. They saw it as proof that their enemies were not serious, a nation of shopkeepers who had stumbled into a war they didn't have the stomach for. But this argument began to ring hollow in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Others, particularly the more technically minded soldiers, would counter this view with cold, hard logic. Look at the bottle, a former engineer might argue. The glass is flawless. The cap is perfectly machined. To produce millions of these, every single day, requires a level of industrial quality control that our own factories, even before the bombing, struggled to achieve for essential components. They began to see the drink not as a symbol of weakness, but as a terrifying indicator of surplus capacity. The American camp authorities observed this phenomenon with great interest. The official reports of camp commandants, often written in dry, bureaucratic language, frequently noted the prisoners' fascination with the minutiae of American life. Colonel D.C. Smith, a hypothetical but representative commander of a large POW camp, might have written in a monthly report, "The German prisoners display an insatiable curiosity about our industrial processes. We have found that lectures on topics like automotive manufacturing or agricultural mechanization are more popular than any other form of re-education. Their questions are specific and highly technical. They seem less interested in our political ideals than in the horsepower of our tractors and the output of our steel mills." An item as mundane as a Coke bottle can trigger a week-long debate about glass-blowing technology and the logistics of sugar distribution. This was a consistent observation across the camp system. The prisoners were attempting to reverse-engineer the American system from its consumer products. They were trying to understand the blueprint of the machine that had crushed them, and the Coca-Cola bottle was their Rosetta Stone. To truly grasp the lesson contained within that bottle, one must perform a bill of materials analysis, comparing the American reality with the German one. First, the sugar. A single bottle of Coca-Cola required a substantial amount of refined sugar. The United States, in the 1,940 seconds, had unfettered access to the vast sugarcane plantations of Cuba, the Caribbean, and the American South. Germany, cut off by the British naval blockade, was reliant on heavily rationed sugar beets, a far less efficient source. Second, the bottle itself. Mass-producing glass containers of consistent quality requires immense quantities of silica sand and, more importantly, a colossal expenditure of energy for the furnaces. America, with its abundant coal and burgeoning electrical grid, could afford this energy cost for a trivial consumer product. In Germany, that same energy was desperately needed to smelt steel for panzers. Third, the cap. A small piece of stamped steel with a cork or rubber seal. Trivial, yet it represented access to steel and rubber that was not already earmarked for the war machine. For the Third Reich, every scrap of steel and every ounce of Buna-S synthetic rubber was a strategic resource, jealously guarded for military use. America's industrial base was so vast it could afford to stamp out billions of bottle caps without impacting the production of a single bullet. Finally, the logistics, the purified water, the bottling plants, the trucks, the trains, and the fuel required to move this product from factory to camp. It was a logistical chain of incredible complexity, dedicated to a non-essential good. Germany struggled to get gasoline to Rommel's front line. America had a parallel and completely separate logistics network to distribute a soft drink. The conclusion of these debates, whether spoken aloud or held in the quiet of a man's own thoughts, was inescapable and demoralizing. The Coca-Cola bottle was a master class in total war, taught from the perspective of the victor. It proved that the conflict was not merely a clash of soldiers on the battlefield, but a collision of entire industrial systems. It demonstrated that true national power in the 20th century was not just the ability to build a formidable army, but the ability to build that army without demanding crippling sacrifices from the civilian population. It was the power of a deep, resilient, and almost infinitely scalable economic base. The veterans of the Afrika Korps had prided themselves on their ability to make do, to fight with less. The bottle taught them a brutal lesson. In a modern industrial war, making do is a strategy for survival, not for victory. Victory belongs to the side that doesn't have to. The bottle of Coca-Cola had been a symbol, a potent and digestible metaphor for American power, but soon, for tens of thousands of Afrika Korps prisoners, that abstract symbol would be replaced by direct, unmediated observation. In accordance with the 929 Geneva Convention, which permitted a captor nation to use enlisted prisoners of war for non-military labor, the U.S. government established a widespread program to help alleviate wartime manpower shortages, particularly in agriculture and low-risk industries. This decision, born of economic necessity, inadvertently became the single most effective denazification and re-education program imaginable. It took the German soldier out of the controlled, artificial environment of the camp and plunged him directly into the roaring furnace of the American economy. For the first time, they would see the arsenal of democracy, not through a newsreel or a propaganda leaflet, but with their own eyes, up close and personal. For the many prisoners sent to the vast farmlands of the Midwest and the South, the experience was a complete inversion of their entire understanding of agriculture and national sustenance. The National Socialist ideology had glorified the German peasant, the Times Bauer asterisk, as the bedrock of the nation, celebrating a romantic ideal of Blut und Boden, blood and soil. This ideal was rooted in the image of small, family-owned farms worked with diligence and a deep connection to the land. What the DAC veterans encountered in America was something else entirely, agriculture as a form of heavy industry. In their memoirs, prisoners consistently express their utter astonishment at the scale and mechanization of American farming. A German soldier, whose family might have proudly farmed a 10-hectare plot with a horse-drawn plough, would find himself working for a single farmer who owned hundreds of hectares and commanded a fleet of John Deere tractors, combine harvesters, and mechanical balers. They witnessed a level of productivity that was simply science fiction. One prisoner, working on a Minnesota farm, wrote home in a censored letter, "One man here, with his machines, can harvest more wheat in a day than our entire village could in a week. The fuel for his tractor is not rationed. It flows from a large tank. He complains about the price of things, but his wife drives to town in their own automobile to buy groceries we have not seen in years." This was a profound ideological shock. The American farmer was not a peasant. He was a capitalist, a technician, and the land was not a mystical entity but a factor of production, made to yield a surplus so vast it was almost obscene. For those assigned to labor details in other sectors, the lessons were just as stark. Prisoners working in lumber mills, canning factories, or on infrastructure projects were often located near the main arteries of American commerce, the railway lines. Here, they became unwilling spectators to a daily parade of overwhelming industrial might. Picture a group of DAC veterans taking a water break from laying track siding in Ohio. In the distance, a train whistle blows. It is not the short, shrill sound of a German locomotive pulling a dozen cars. This is a deep, resonant horn that heralds the approach of a monster. A giant diesel-electric engine appears, pulling a train that seems to have no end. For 20 minutes, it thunders past them, the ground shaking, and on its flatbed cars is the very hardware of their defeat. They see not one or two, but dozens of brand-new, olive-drab M4 Sherman tanks, fresh from the Detroit arsenal, chained down for their journey to the coast. Then come cars carrying aircraft fuselages, crated Allison engines, stacks of steel plates, and boxcars filled with ammunition, tires, and uniforms. It is a river of steel, an endless conveyor belt connecting the factory to the front. A German NCO who had fought at Kasserine Pass, where a handful of new Tiger tanks were treated as precious, war-winning assets, would watch this and understand the futility of it all. Germany produced 1,347 Tiger tanks in the entire war. The United States produced nearly 50,000 Shermans. This train was not just a train, it was a statistical truth made mobile, a relentless, rolling demonstration that for every tank they managed to destroy, America was building 30 more. The raw numbers behind this visual spectacle confirm the unbridgeable gap. In 1944, the peak of its war production, the United States smelted over 81 million metric tons of steel. The Greater German Reich, including all its occupied territories, strained to produce just over 34 million tons. The difference alone was more than the entire output of the Soviet Union. The story was the same in every critical resource. America in 1944 produced over 1 billion barrels of crude oil from its own domestic wells. Germany, with no significant natural reserves, was entirely dependent on the vulnerable Ploesti oil fields in Romania and a handful of synthetic fuel plants that were prime targets for Allied bombers, producing a mere fraction of that amount. Perhaps the most telling statistic for the common German soldier was in motor transport. The Wehrmacht, despite its image as a modern, mechanized force, was shockingly dependent on animal power. Over 80% of its logistical and artillery transport on the Eastern Front was horse-drawn. The United States, in a single year, produced more than 650,000 military trucks. This single fact explained everything. The Red Ball Express that kept Patton's Third Army supplied, the well-fed GIs, the mountains of ammunition. While the German army moved at the speed of a horse, the American army moved at the speed of the internal combustion engine, an engine it could fuel and produce on a scale that was simply otherworldly. This was not propaganda. Propaganda can be doubted, dismissed as lies or exaggeration. But what these prisoners saw could not be denied. It was the physical reality of the nation they were fighting. Seeing a farmer effortlessly plough a 200-hectare field, watching a mile-long train of new tanks thunder by, or helping to load crates of canned food destined for an army that never went hungry. These experiences were more persuasive than any lecture on the virtues of democracy. It was a first-hand, uncurated education in the true meaning of industrial power. It broke down their ideological conditioning not by attacking it directly, but by rendering it irrelevant. The core tenets of their belief system, the superiority of the German soldier, the invincibility of the Reich, the weakness of the decadent West crumbled into dust when confronted with the simple, undeniable, and overwhelming truth of American productivity. They were not just prisoners of war, they were witnesses to the very engine of their own destruction. While the men of the Afrika Korps were physically imprisoned, trapped behind the mundane reality of barbed wire fences, they found themselves living within a bizarre and deeply unsettling paradox. They were captives, yet they were safer, better fed, and in some ways freer than their own families back in the Reich. The American POW camp was not a place of punishment and deprivation in the way they understood it. It was a gilded cage, a place where the material comforts and personal opportunities were so unexpectedly superior to their previous existence that it created a profound and corrosive psychological crisis. This was not the harsh, honorable captivity they might have imagined. It was a comfortable, secure, and deeply confusing form of confinement that systematically undermined their most cherished beliefs about strength, sacrifice, and the very nature of the German and American systems. One of the most surreal aspects of camp life was the existence of a thriving internal economy. In accordance with the Geneva Convention, prisoners who worked were paid for their labor. This was not in US currency, which was forbidden, but in a camp-specific scrip or coupon system. A prisoner could earn up to 80 cents a day, a respectable sum that translated into significant purchasing power within the camp's self-contained world. The hub of this world was the Post Exchange, or PX, a concept entirely alien to the German military experience. The PX was, in essence, a well-stocked general store. Inside, a DAC veteran who a year earlier had been battling for a mouthful of brackish water in the desert could now walk up to a counter and purchase items of unimaginable luxury. He could buy packs of American cigarettes like Camels or Lucky Strikes, candy bars from Hershey or Nestle, stationery to write letters home, toiletries, and even American magazines like Life and the Saturday Evening Post. The sight of these glossy magazines, with their stunning color photographs of American life, movie stars, and advertisements for consumer goods, was a potent form of unfiltered propaganda. The transactions in the PX were a weekly ritual of cognitive dissonance. A German soldier would hand over the scrip he earned picking cotton in a Texas field and receive in return a product whose very existence spoke to a level of consumer surplus that his own nation could not even dream of. Beyond material goods, the camps offered something even more shocking, opportunity. German culture places a high value on education, organization, and self-improvement, and the prisoners, with endless time on their hands, organized their camp lives with remarkable thoroughness. The American authorities, far from discouraging this, actively facilitated it. Most large camps developed what were, in effect, fully fledged universities behind the wire. Prisoners with academic or professional backgrounds became instructors, offering courses on everything from mathematics and engineering to history, philosophy, and most popular of all, English. Men who had left their studies to join the army could now earn certificates and diplomas that were, in some cases, later recognized by post-war German universities. This intellectual life was complemented by a rich cultural scene. The prisoners formed orchestras and choirs, performing the works of Bach and Beethoven with instruments often provided by the American YMCA. They established theatre troupes, staging complex productions of Goethe and Schiller, and of course they played soccer. Highly organized and fiercely competitive camp leagues became a central feature of their lives, a welcome outlet for their discipline and aggression. As Georg Gärtner noted in his diary, this structured life of learning and recreation was a desperate attempt to maintain their sanity and self-respect, yet it was only possible because their captors provided the stability, security, and resources to allow it. The most damning aspect of this gilded cage was revealed in a simple comparison of daily rations and living conditions. According to the strict regulations of the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, German prisoners of war were to be fed a diet equivalent to that of American soldiers in training, often exceeding 3,000 calories per day. This diet included daily allotments of meat, dairy, fresh vegetables, and bread, the very items that had stunned them upon their arrival. Back home, the German civilian population was enduring a slow, grinding process of starvation. By 1944, the official ration allowance for a normal adult in a city like Berlin had plummeted to under 1,500 calories a day, and even that was often unavailable. A letter from home, when it finally arrived, would be read by a POW who had just eaten a meal of beef stew and buttered bread. The letter would speak of bombed-out homes, of huddling in air raid shelters, of a desperate struggle for potatoes and a sliver of horse meat. The ultimate paradox was safety. While their wives, parents, and children lived in constant terror of the Allied strategic bombing campaign, the nightly visits from the RAF, and the daily terror of the USAAF's B-17 seconds, the German soldier in America slept in a warm, secure barrack, protected by the very nation that was devastating his homeland. He was, without question, in the safest place a German man could be in 1944. This reality created an unbearable psychological burden. On one hand, there was the natural human instinct for survival and the appreciation for the material comfort and safety they enjoyed. But on the other, there was a profound and gnawing sense of guilt. They were living well while their families suffered. They were idle while their comrades were dying in the hedgerows of Normandy or the frozen hell of the Eastern Front. This guilt was a powerful acid, dissolving the bonds of their former ideology. How could the German system be superior if it could not feed its own people? How could the Americans be the decadent weaklings of Goebbels' propaganda if they could afford to house their enemies in such relative luxury while simultaneously waging a global war? The gilded cage of the American POW camp did more than just confine the German soldier's body. It imprisoned his mind in a labyrinth of contradiction and doubt, from which his old certainties could never escape intact. The American POW camp was the final battlefield for the men of the Afrika Korps, but it was a conflict fought not with tanks and guns, but with information and ideas. For years their minds had been sealed within the hermetic information system of the Third Reich, a world meticulously crafted by Dr. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda. Every newspaper article, radio broadcast, and newsreel they had consumed was designed to reinforce a single, monolithic narrative of German superiority, Aryan destiny, and inevitable victory. When they were first exposed to American news sources within the camps through camp-sponsored newspapers or the magazines available in the PX, Their initial conditioned reaction was one of deep cynicism. They saw it as just a different flavor of propaganda. Slicker, perhaps more subtle, but fundamentally a pack of lies designed to demoralize them. They were trained propaganda connoisseurs, and they believed they could see the puppet strings. What they were unprepared for was the crushing weight of verifiable, consistent, and undeniable truth. The first major cracks in this wall of skepticism appeared with the reporting of major world events. On June 6, 1944, the prisoners heard the news of the D-Day landings in Normandy. Their immediate reaction, fueled by years of propaganda about the impregnable Atlantic Wall, was derision. They confidently assured their American guards that this invasion would be a bloody failure, thrown back into the sea within hours, just as the propagandists in Berlin had always promised. But then they saw the American newspapers. Instead of triumphant headlines and vague pronouncements, they saw detailed maps of the landing beaches Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. They read the names of the specific American, British, and Canadian divisions involved. Most shockingly, they saw the casualty lists. Newspapers like the New York Times reported the brutal, grinding reality of the fight, especially the horrific losses suffered by American troops at Omaha Beach. This was inconceivable to a German soldier. The German High Command's communiques, the Times Wehrmachtbericht *, spoke only of enemy losses and heroic victories. To admit your own heavy casualties in public was a sign of unthinkable weakness. But as the days turned into weeks, and the papers showed the Allied beachhead expanding and the city of Cherbourg falling, the prisoners were forced into a terrible realization. The American reports were not lies. A system that could openly report its own grievous losses and still press forward was not weak. It was displaying a confidence so profound it had no need to lie to its own people. The print media was powerful, but it was the visual media, particularly Life magazine, that delivered the psychological coup de grâce. A German soldier could pick up a copy of Life in the PX and be confronted with a series of images that systematically annihilated his entire worldview. One page might feature a stunning, full-color aerial photograph of the Willow Run factory in Michigan, showing a mile-long assembly line where B-24 Liberator bombers were being produced at a rate of 1 per hour. The sheer scale, the order, the sheer industrial power on display was something no German newsreel had ever shown. Another page might feature a photo essay on Rosie the Riveter, showing healthy, smiling, confident American women operating complex machinery, a stark contrast to the grim, weary faces of their own mothers and wives struggling with food shortages back home. Perhaps most devastating were the uncensored combat photographs. They saw the faces of dead American soldiers on a beachhead, the shattered wreckage of their own panzer force in a Normandy lane, the grim reality of a war that was being lost, presented not with triumphant glee, but with a kind of sober, factual gravity. These were not the blurry, sanitized, heroic images of the Times Deutsche Wochenschau *. This was the war as it truly was, and the evidence was irrefutable. A photograph of a 1,000-bomber raid darkening the skies over Germany did not need a caption to explain its meaning. This daily exposure to American reality served to dismantle, piece by piece, the core tenets of Goebbels' propaganda machine. First was the principle of the big lie, the idea that a lie, if made big enough and repeated often enough, will be believed. The big lie of the Third Reich was that Germany was the world's preeminent power, destined to win the war. The prisoner's daily life, surrounded by American abundance, proved this to be utterly false. Second was the constant demonization of the enemy. Goebbels had painted Americans as a decadent, racially mixed, and cowardly society of gangsters. The prisoner's direct experience was with disciplined, professional, and often surprisingly humane American soldiers. The caricature simply could not survive contact with reality. Third, and perhaps most critically for morale, was the promise of Time's Wunderwaffen *, or wonder weapons. As the war turned against Germany, Goebbels' propaganda shifted to promising imminent salvation through a host of secret, technologically advanced weapons that would snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. While the V-1 and V-2 rockets were real, they were strategically insignificant. The true wonder weapon of World War II was not the Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter, of which a few hundred were ever built. It was the American Sherman tank, backed by a logistical and industrial system that could place a Coca-Cola bottling plant in the middle of a war zone. The daily, mundane, verifiable evidence of American life. Its food, its magazines, its sheer normality was the ultimate weapon against a political system built entirely on a foundation of lies. The truth, it turned out, was the most effective propaganda of all. Caught between two realities that were fundamentally irreconcilable, the German prisoner of war faced his most profound challenge: communication. He lived in the gilded cage of an American camp, a world of surreal abundance, while his family inhabited the collapsing inferno of the Third Reich. The bridge between these two worlds was the humble letter, a fragile vessel of words tasked with an impossible mission. But this bridge was guarded at both ends. Every word written and received was filtered through multiple layers of censorship, stripped of nuance, and often robbed of its intended meaning. The simple act of writing home became a complex exercise in navigating what could be said, what could be implied, and what must be left in the vast, agonizing gulf of silence. The prisoners of the Afrika Korps were not just physically isolated from their homeland, they were informationally and emotionally quarantined, unable to explain the unbelievable truth of their new existence or fully comprehend the horrifying truth of the one they had left behind. The letters sent from the American camps, now preserved in historical archives, are masterclasses in understatement and coded language. The prisoners knew their mail was being read by American censors, and they quickly learned what was permissible. They were not allowed to discuss military matters, the specific locations of their camps, or details of war production they might have observed. But a more subtle form of self-censorship also took hold. How could a man describe eating beef stew and white bread to a wife who was likely subsisting on watery turnip soup? To do so would seem cruel, a boastful and unbelievable fiction. So they resorted to a carefully curated vocabulary of restraint. A prisoner would write, "My health is good, and the treatment is correct according to the international conventions." Correct was a safe, neutral word that passed the censors, but gave no hint of the shocking reality. He might write, "We receive sufficient food to maintain our strength." To an American censor, this was a simple statement of fact. To the prisoner's family in bombed-out Hamburg, sufficient food sounded like a bare, grim subsistence, not the mountains of calories it actually represented. They were trying to communicate reassurance without causing pain or disbelief, but the result was a profound disconnect. The truth of their condition was so far outside the German frame of reference that it was, for all intents and purposes, untranslatable. The true emotional torment, however, came from the mail flowing in the opposite direction. Letters from home, often delayed for months, were lifelines that could also be daggers to the heart. In the quiet of his barrack, a DAK veteran, safe and well-fed, would unfold a thin piece of paper and be plunged into the hell his family was enduring. The memoir of Georg Gärtner is filled with the anguish this created. He would read of beloved friends killed in action on the Eastern Front, of his home city of Schweinfurt being flattened by successive waves of B-17 seconds, of his parents' desperate struggle to find food in the ruins. Each letter was a fresh delivery of guilt and impotence. One prisoner described the experience as being like watching your house burn down from the moon. They were safe, but their safety felt like a betrayal. The contrast was obscene. They had spent their morning playing a game of soccer, while their brothers were dying in the Hürtgen forest. They had just eaten a dinner of pork chops, while their children were hungry. This disconnect created a deep and lasting psychological wound, a sense of alienation from the very people they longed for most. The suffering of their families made their own material comfort feel like a shameful secret. The very system of mail delivery was another testament to the Allied logistical dominance that so haunted the prisoners. The Victory Mail, or V-Mail, system was an industrial marvel. To save precious cargo space on ships and planes, letters to and from the front were written on standardized forms, which were then censored, photographed, and converted onto reels of microfilm. A single mailbag that would have carried 2,000 physical letters could carry 1,600,000 microfilmed ones. These reels were flown across the Atlantic, and at their destination, the letters were printed out at about 1/4 size and delivered. It was a system of astonishing efficiency, another casual miracle of the arsenal of democracy. But it also institutionalized the process of censorship. The American censors, reading the prisoners' mail, were primarily looking for security risks. But on the other end, the German censors had a very different objective. As the war worsened, the Nazi regime became terrified of defeatism on the home front. A letter from a son in an American POW camp describing abundant food and humane treatment was seen as a dangerous piece of enemy propaganda. Such letters were often heavily redacted or simply never delivered, replaced by a cold notification that the prisoner was well. The regime could not allow the truth of the American home front to poison the morale of a populace being exhorted to total sacrifice. Ultimately, the German prisoner in America was a man rendered voiceless, trapped in an isolation more profound than mere barbed wire could create. He could not share the shocking truth of his experience with his family, partly out of a desire not to cause them pain, and partly because he knew he would not be believed. His attempts at communication were neutered by censors on both sides, each with their own agenda. The news he received from home only deepened his sense of guilt and alienation, making him a stranger to the suffering of his own nation. He was no longer just a German soldier. He was something else, a hybrid creature living between two worlds, fully belonging to neither. The gilded cage had not just confined his body, it had severed his connection to his past, leaving him to grapple with a new, bewildering reality that he was forced to endure in utter and absolute solitude. The journey of the German prisoner in America was a multi-stage psychological odyssey. The first stage was shock, the visceral, emotional reaction to a level of abundance that bordered on the magical. The second was observation and analysis, the intellectual process of deconstructing the industrial and logistical power that made such abundance possible. The final stage, and the most transformative, was ideological. The countless data points gathered over months and years, the Coca-Cola, the trains, the farms, the magazines began to coalesce into a coherent and devastating critique of the very foundation of their worldview. The seeds of doubt, planted in the Tunisian desert and watered in the mess halls of Texas, now began to sprout into a new and radical understanding of the world, a worldview that stood in direct opposition to the core tenets of National Socialism they had been raised to believe were immutable truths. This ideological transformation was most evident in the debates that raged within the camp walls, particularly around the issue of race. The official American re-education programs, which involved lectures on the virtues of democracy, were often met with cynicism and resistance. But the unofficial, experiential education was far more potent. The prisoners, who had been marinated in the Nazi doctrine of Aryan racial purity and the supposed degeneracy of multi-ethnic societies, were confronted daily by a reality that refuted their entire ideology. They were guarded by Black American soldiers. They were processed by Jewish American administrators. They worked alongside Mexican American laborers in the fields. The camp newspaper, Der Ruf, which was intended to promote democratic ideals, became a forum where prisoners like Alfred Andersch and Hans Werner Richter began to openly grapple with these contradictions. They saw that this American mongrel society was not chaotic and weak, as Goebbels had insisted, but was in fact astonishingly well organized, unified in purpose, and capable of projecting a power that had crushed their supposedly pure and superior master race. The simple, undeniable fact of a functioning, powerful, multiracial America was a more effective anti-racist argument than any lecture. For a significant number of prisoners, particularly those who would go on to become leaders in the post-war Federal Republic of Germany, captivity was a profound political and economic awakening. They had been products of the Nazi economic system, a system that presented itself as a miracle of efficiency, eliminating unemployment and building a mighty war machine. In the American camps, they saw that this system was a hollow facade, a command economy geared for a single, finite, and ultimately self-destructive purpose: war. They witnessed firsthand the generative power of American free market capitalism. It was chaotic, individualistic, and often seemed wasteful, but its ability to produce wealth on a mass scale was undeniable. They saw a system that could create both guns, and times butter, that could build an armada of aircraft carriers while still ensuring its citizens had access to automobiles and consumer goods. The German model was one of totalizing sacrifice for the state. The American model, as they saw it, was one of individual aspiration, fueling a national engine of immense power. This was a revolutionary concept, and it formed the intellectual bedrock for the Times Wirtschaftswunder *, the West German economic miracle, which would be built on the very principles of market economics and consumer demand they first witnessed as prisoners of war. This new reality systematically dismantled the three central pillars of the National Socialist ideology. The first pillar was Blut und Boden, blood and soil. This was the romantic, mystical belief in the German peasant's sacred connection to the homeland, a celebration of small-scale, traditional agriculture. The prisoner's experience on the vast, mechanized farms of the American Midwest made this ideal seem tragically quaint and inefficient. They saw that food production was not about mystique, it was about horsepower, chemical fertilizers, and economies of scale. American industrial agriculture, devoid of any romanticism, was what fed the world, while the blood and soil ideology was starving their own people. The second pillar was the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community, a racially pure society unified by a single will and a commitment to collective sacrifice. This, too, crumbled in the face of American reality. American strength seemed to derive from its very opposite, a messy, argumentative, and deeply individualistic culture. Yet this society of individuals could coalesce with terrifying speed and purpose when threatened, outproducing and out-innovating the rigidly controlled German community. The final and most important pillar, Aryan racial superiority, was the most comprehensively demolished. The men of the Afrika Korps, the supposed martial elite of the master race, had been unequivocally beaten, and their daily lives were now managed by the multi-ethnic society they had been taught to despise. For these men, the American POW camp became a crucible of forced enlightenment. It was not a formal process of re-education imposed from above, but a self-driven denazification, a slow and often painful shedding of a lifetime of indoctrination in the face of overwhelming, contradictory evidence. They entered the camps as soldiers of the Third Reich, believers in a narrative of their own supremacy. They would leave as men whose certainties had been shattered, whose ideology had been proven bankrupt not by words, but by reality. The American system was not perfect, as they could clearly see in its own internal struggles with race and inequality. But it was undeniably more powerful, more resilient, and more productive than their own. This unwelcome, undeniable truth, learned in the fields and factories and mess halls of their captivity, planted the seeds of a new worldview. It was these seeds that many would carry back to the ruins of Germany, to begin the long and arduous task of building a new, democratic nation from the ashes of the old. The unconditional surrender of the German High Command on May 8, 1945, was not an end, but a transition. Inside the American POW camps, the news was received with a complex mixture of profound relief and deep, gnawing anxiety. The dying was over. The war, the all-consuming reality that had defined their entire adult lives, had finally ceased. But in the quiet that followed the initial celebrations, a new uncertainty settled. They were no longer soldiers, and soon they would no longer be prisoners. But what were they? And what was this home they were meant to return to? The Germany they had left behind, the proud, seemingly invincible Reich of 1941, no longer existed. It had been consumed by a firestorm of its own making. The long journey home would not be a triumphant return, but a passage into the heart of an apocalypse, a confrontation with a truth far more horrifying than anything they had yet witnessed. Before they could even begin that physical journey, they were forced to undertake a final, brutal, moral one. As part of a mandatory denazification program, the American authorities began screening films for the prisoners. These were not the Hollywood productions they had occasionally been shown for entertainment. These were the first raw, uncensored newsreels from the newly liberated concentration camps of Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, and Dachau. The men were marched into mess halls and makeshift theaters, the lights went down, and the projectors whirred to life. What they saw on the screen defied all language, all reason, all humanity. They saw skeletal figures in striped pajamas, staring with dead eyes from behind barbed wire. They saw bulldozers pushing mountains of emaciated corpses into mass graves. They saw the ovens, the piles of human hair, the stacks of children's shoes. A stunned, horrified silence fell over the hardened veterans of the Afrika Korps. These were not propaganda images. Their stark, grainy reality was undeniable. For the vast majority of these soldiers, who had held on to the belief that they were fighting a clean war, this was the ultimate, soul-shattering revelation. The entire system they had fought and bled for was not just a political or military enterprise, it was a machinery of industrial-scale murder. The final issues of camp newspapers from this period are filled with agonized editorials and letters from prisoners trying to process this horror, to separate their own actions as soldiers from the unimaginable crimes of the state they had served. This was the true face of the regime, and the sight of it burned away the last vestiges of their old identity. The physical journey home began months later, and it was a descent into a grey, shattered world. Packed into boxcars, they crossed the Atlantic in reverse and were deposited into the ruins of their homeland. The writer Wolfgang W.E. Samuel, who was a boy at the time but whose post-war work collected the experiences of many returning soldiers, provides a haunting composite picture of this journey. The trains moved slowly, grinding their way through a landscape of utter devastation, the Times Trümmerlandschaft asterisk. Cities that had been proud centres of German culture were now little more than geographic expressions, vast fields of rubble punctuated by the skeletal shells of buildings. Cologne, Hamburg, Dresden, Berlin, all were monuments to the totality of their defeat. From the train, the returning soldiers saw the civilian population for the first time. They were a people of ghosts, gaunt, dressed in rags, their faces etched with a weary, hollowed-out trauma. The prisoners, still wearing their relatively clean American-issued clothes, and with the healthy complexion that comes from 3 square meals a day, were stared at with a mixture of curiosity, envy, and deep resentment. They were not seen as returning heroes, but as alien creatures from another world, men who had somehow escaped the final, apocalyptic suffering of the German nation. This encounter with their own people brought with it the crushing psychological burden of time's collective Schuld asterisk, collective guilt. In a cruel and profound irony, the very thing that had saved them, their capture and comfortable confinement in America, now became a source of shame and alienation. They had not endured the firebombing of Dresden. They had not scavenged for scraps of food in the ruins of Berlin. They had not watched their families die from starvation or disease in the final agonizing months of the war. They had been playing soccer and attending lectures on engineering while their nation was immolated. This created an unbridgeable chasm. How could they explain their experience of America's impossible abundance to a people who had lost everything? How could they complain about the boredom of captivity to those who had survived the hell of the Eastern Front's collapse? Their well-fed appearance, a testament to the enemy's logistical might, was now a mark of otherness, a silent accusation that they had not shared in the ultimate national sacrifice. They were survivors, but they had survived the wrong war. So they returned not as sons and brothers, but as strangers in their own land. They had left a nation at the height of its arrogant power, fueled by a belief in its own destiny and superiority. They returned to a moral and physical wasteland, a nation crushed by the weight of its own crimes, and comprehensively defeated by a power it had fatally underestimated. The returning soldier of the Afrika Korps was a man uniquely haunted. He carried the ghosts of his comrades who had died in the desert, but he also carried the newer, more complex ghosts of his time in America. He had seen the lie of the Third Reich exposed not by a lecture, but by a bottle of Coca-Cola. He had understood the true nature of American power, not from a propaganda film, but from the window of a prison train. He was a man who knew two profound truths at once: the absolute horror of what his country had done, and the absolute unassailable power of the nation that had brought it to justice. It is 60 years later. A man, now stooped with age, his face a roadmap of a long and difficult life, sits on a park bench in a bustling, prosperous German city. The city has been entirely rebuilt. Its modern glass and steel architecture has long since erased the scars of the war. Young people rush past, talking on mobile phones, their minds on matters of commerce and leisure, utterly disconnected from the history that lies just beneath the pavement. A young boy, no older than 10, runs up to a vending machine and with the clink of a euro coin retrieves a familiar, curved bottle. He opens it with a hiss, the sound sharp and clean in the afternoon air. The old man watches, and for a moment he is no longer in the peaceful Germany of the 21st century. He is back in the dust and heat of a Texas mess hall, a young man in a worn uniform, holding that same impossible object in his hand for the very first time. He is the veteran of the Afrika Korps, and that bottle of Coca-Cola is not just a drink, it is the ghost of a lost world and the symbol of the one that replaced it. The post-war Americanization of West Germany was not a formal policy imposed by the victors, but a cultural and economic osmosis that began in the POW camps. The values that had so shocked the German prisoners, mass consumerism, an emphasis on individual comfort, and the logic of market-driven production became the very bedrock of West Germany's stunning recovery, the Wirtschaftswunder mal or economic miracle. Sociologists of the era, particularly those of the influential Frankfurt School, analyzed this profound societal shift. They saw a nation consciously turning its back on the Prussian martial ideals of sacrifice, discipline, and state worship that had led to catastrophe. In their place, West Germans embraced a new identity centered on economic productivity, material prosperity, and domestic life. The ideal citizen was no longer the uniformed soldier, but the industrious worker and the savvy consumer. The very things the prisoners had first witnessed as symbols of enemy power, the well-stocked store, the privately owned automobile, the household appliance became the new, potent symbols of German success. In a profound historical irony, Germany's path to recovery and democratic stability was paved with the very principles of capitalism and consumerism it had first encountered in its moment of total defeat. No single product embodied this transformation more perfectly than Coca-Cola itself. The company had a pre-war presence in Germany, but the conflict had severed all ties. In the immediate aftermath of the surrender, as the Allies began the monumental task of rebuilding, Coca-Cola followed the flag. The same technical observers who had built bottling plants for the US Army now set about re-establishing the brand for the new German market. In the grey, ruined cities, the bright red Coca-Cola logo was one of the first splashes of vibrant colour to reappear. It became a ubiquitous symbol of the American presence, of the Marshall Plan, and of the new era of peace and commerce. Advertisements from the late 1940s and 1950s sold not just a drink, but an aspirational lifestyle. The pause that refreshes was a promise of a break from the grim hardships of Reconstruction, a small taste of the carefree, prosperous American life the Germans had now seen was possible. For the returning DAK veteran, seeing a young German couple sharing a Coke at a sidewalk cafe was a surreal spectacle. It was the ultimate sign that the war was truly over. The liquid weapon that had so shocked him in captivity was now a mundane, accepted, and even beloved part of his own culture. The statistical reality of this transformation is the final, irrefutable proof of the thesis. The Third Reich, for all its grandiose architecture and military parades, left behind an economic legacy of absolute ruin. In 1945, Germany's industrial capacity was shattered, its cities were rubble, and its currency, the Reichsmark, was so worthless that the economy reverted to a primitive system of barter, with American cigarettes serving as the most stable medium of exchange. Into this void came the Marshall Plan, which pumped billions of American dollars into the West German economy, providing the capital needed to rebuild the factories. The results were explosive. By the mid-1950s, West Germany was one of the fastest-growing economies in the world. The production of passenger cars, which had been zero during the war, soared into the millions. The shelves of shops, once empty, were now filled with the very consumer goods that had once seemed like science fiction to the prisoners in America. Coca-Cola was the liquid vanguard of this new economic order. Its success was a testament to a system that generated wealth by creating and satisfying consumer desire, a stark contrast to the Nazi system which had consumed the wealth of its nation and its victims in the pursuit of military conquest. And so, we return to the old man on the park bench. He watches the boy finish his drink, a simple, happy, and utterly normal act. In that moment, the entire story comes full circle. The thesis, first formed in the sensory deprivation of the North African desert, is given its final, quiet confirmation. The Second World War was not won by the Übermensch, the mythic Aryan Superman, but by the common man, the American GI who took for granted the industrial behemoth that stood behind him. It was a war decided not on the battlefields of Kursk or Normandy, but on the assembly lines of Detroit and in the boardrooms of Atlanta. The bottle of Coca-Cola was more than a shock, it was a prophecy. It foretold a new world order where economic power, the ability to generate unimaginable wealth and project a lifestyle of irresistible comfort, would ultimately prove more decisive than legions of tanks and the most disciplined soldiers. The final, enduring victory did not belong to the general, but to the factory, and its most potent and lasting weapon was not a bomb, but a simple, sugary, carbonated taste of home that, once experienced, could never be forgotten.